It was an ordinary night at Cedar Hospital in Los Angeles when something extraordinary happened to upset the emergency room routine. At around 3 a.m., an ambulance arrived at the hospital. The rear doors opened, revealing a figure that looked like it had stepped out of a nightmare. She was tall, dressed in a blood-stained white dress that floated around her like fog in a cemetery. But it wasn't her outfit that made the witness's blood run cold. It was her face, or rather the lack of it. Where there should have been human features, there was only a smooth, immaculate white surface, with no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Only 2 black holes where her eyes should have been broke the continuity of this frightening facade. She walked at a serene, almost regal pace, as if floating just above the ground, heading for the hospital's automatic doors, which opened before her as if to welcome a ghost. The nurses and doctors, accustomed to emergencies and nighttime dramas, froze, unable to understand or react to what they were seeing. She held out a hand to the nearest nurse, a hand of a whiteness to match her face, where a note was folded. On the paper, just 3 words: "Please help me." Initial incomprehension gave way to action. Despite the fear, the duty to care took over. She was taken to an examination room where the doctors tried to unravel the mystery of this apparition. How did she breathe? How could she live without apparent orifices? Was it a hoax of morbid sophistication, or something far more sinister? Examinations began, but each test only deepened the mystery. His body looked human, with organs functioning normally, but his face remained an enigma. Magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, showed no bone structure where the face should have been, just a void. Meanwhile, indescribable tension gripped the hospital. Rumors circulated among staff and patients alike, speaking of a supernatural creature, a harbinger of calamity. Some spoke of leaving, others of praying. But the real horror began when, in the middle of the night, screams tore through the silence of the corridors. The nurses, rushing to the source of the tumult, discovered a scene of horror in the room where the faceless woman had been placed. One of the doctors lay on the floor, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, while the woman stood, her smooth face twisted impossibly into a gaping mouth, from which emanated an inhuman howl. In a burst of courage, or perhaps madness, one of the guards stepped forward, brandishing his truncheon. But before he could even get close, the creature turned its attention to him. With a sudden, inhumanly swift movement, it extended its hand towards the guard. Where its fingers should have been, there were now razor-sharp appendages that pierced the unfortunate man's body. With a grace that contrasted violently with the violence of her actions, she began to make her way towards the hospital exit, leaving behind a wake of terror and confusion. The other guards tried to stop her, but their bullets and blows seemed to be lost in the void, as if absorbed by a bottomless abyss. Arriving at the main entrance, the creature paused for a moment, turning its smooth face towards the petrified onlookers. Then, without a sound, it passed through the automatic doors and dissolved into the night, as if it had never been of this world. The hospital tried to return to normal, but how could we ignore what had happened? Weeks passed, then months, and life returned to normal. But for those who had seen, who had lived through that night of horror, nothing was the same. They knew that somewhere, in the darkness, the creature could still be lurking, waiting for the moment to return. The once carefree city was now shrouded in an aura of mistrust and fear. The streets, lively until late at night, now emptied as soon as dusk fell, the inhabitants preferring the serenity of their homes to the uncertainty of the darkness outside. Michael, a local journalist, had followed the case from the beginning. He had interviewed witnesses, searched the hospital archives, and even tried to trace the creature's origin, but every lead ended in a dead end. The story haunted him. Driven by an intuition he couldn't ignore, Michael decided to start his investigation all over again. He returned to the hospital, spoke to the staff again, and revisited the room where it all began. He scrutinized every detail, every report, every testimony, searching for that elusive link that would tie everything together. It was then that he came across a detail that had been overlooked in the initial confusion: the note the creature had given the nurse. "Help me, please." The words seemed simple, almost innocent, but to Michael they resonated with a new importance. Why would an entity capable of such acts of violence ask for help? And to whom was this request addressed? His quest for answers led him far off the beaten track, into the dark corners of the city, where far-fetched stories and forgotten secrets found refuge. He met people who had seen or heard things that society refused to accept. Tales of entities that were neither quite alive nor quite dead, trapped in a tortured existence. Michael began to understand that the story of the faceless creature was not unique, but part of a much larger phenomenon. The note was not a request to the people in the hospital that night, but a desperate plea projected across time and space, seeking someone, anyone, who could understand and put an end to his ordeal. Armed with this new understanding, Michael knew he had to act. But how could he help an entity whose very existence defied human understanding? His search led him to ancient practices and beliefs that spoke of communication with the beyond. On the chosen night, he drew strange symbols on the floor of an old abandoned building, lit a few candles, and began to recite incantations that sounded as if they belonged to another era. At first, nothing happened. Then, gradually, a cold mist began to fill the room, and a silhouette slowly took shape in the center of the circle. It was her, the faceless creature, her empty gaze fixed on Michael. Michael made him understand his desire to help, to understand. The creature, sensing this sincerity, began to change. Its smooth face clouded over, as if thousands of faces were trying to break through, each shouting its own story of pain and loss. As Michael watched, fascinated and horrified, the faces jostling each other across the creature's surface, he realized that each represented a soul it had absorbed, lives it had consumed in its desperate quest for liberation. Michael's incantations grew in intensity. The creature began to emit a whisper at first, which grew into a deafening roar, mixing pain, rage, and despair. The room shook, the candles went out, plunging everything into darkness. Suddenly, a bolt of blinding light burst from the creature, illuminating the room with raw clarity. Wide-eyed, Michael saw the trapped souls detach themselves one by one, freed from their eternal torment. The floor shook, and a crack opened beneath the creature, revealing a bottomless abyss from which emanated a strange light and murmuring voices. It was at this precise moment that everything went haywire. The creature, realizing its destiny and driven by renewed rage, fixated on him with searing intensity. Instead of dropping into the abyss to take the curse with him, he lunged at Michael, his hands transforming into shadowy claws. Michael, panic-stricken, tried to recite another incantation, but her claws sank into his flesh with unheard-of violence. The silence that followed was of a different nature, heavy with death and despair. Michael lay on the ground, eyes wide open, staring into nothingness, while the creature stood over him, its smooth face betraying no emotion. Far from being appeased or freed, the creature had absorbed Michael's vital energy, growing even stronger. It disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a room filled with darkness and desolation. Days passed, and Michael's story became a whispered warning in occult circles, a tragic tale of the dangers of dealing with forces humanity was not destined to understand. The faceless creature, more powerful and unpredictable than ever, now roamed free, a shadow among shadows, a waking nightmare ready to resurface at the slightest opportunity, bringing death and desolation to anyone who crossed its path.